Hi everyone, I'm Julie Frey. I'm the curator here at Stan Hywet Hall Gardens, and joining me today is Charles. He is an Oxford Group researcher and a longtime interpreter here at Stan Hywet, and we're going to have a conversation about Henrietta Seiberling and the Oxford Group. As many of you know, today is Friday, June 12th. It's the start of Founders Day weekend here in 2020, but Founders Day activities have all been pushed to virtual experiences. So instead of being able to come to the Gate Lodge in person, we are going to share some of our wonderful research and information with you, and hopefully you'll be able to come and visit at some point in the future. So Charles, I think we'll start off. If you want to give us some background about the Oxford Group and let people know what that movement was all about.
Sure. I think working with the history here over the years, and we get all kind of visitors in the Gatehouse. We have the regular Stan Hywet visitors who maybe don't really know a lot about the 12-step program that started here. And then we have people in the 12-step programs that understand some of the history. Then we have people that really know a lot about it. So you've got a really diverse audience. One of the things that people tend to think of this Oxford Group that Henrietta was involved with might have been a parlor with some ladies with teacups and Bibles, and that was kind of it. And that could be an Oxford Group meeting, but it was actually global. By 1935, Frank Bookman, the founder of the Oxford Group, he was a Lutheran minister from Pennsburg, Pennsylvania, had started to work with foreign countries. He started on campus ministry, particularly at Penn State. That went to the Ivy League schools and into Cambridge and to Oxford, hence the name over in England. And he was working to create these values on an individual level, thinking that if individuals worked on themselves and he could focus on people in decision-making capacity and world leaders, that would affect the climate of the world as far as the political situation and national issues and so forth. And he was quite successful at it, really. It had gone global by then. And just real quickly to give you an idea of what the size of this was, he was credited with the fact that the Nazis could not get a foothold in Denmark during the war, because 3 years prior, the Oxford Group had started working in Denmark and created such cohesion between the churches that they created their own resistance movement. And they found after World War II that the Nazis had a 126-page report on the Oxford Group, that they were considered to be a huge threat to what Adolf Hitler was trying to do. And there was a misquote in Times magazine. They had actually used Frank Bookman's kind of out of context, and it did a lot of PR damage to the Oxford Group, saying that he endorsed Hitler. He could not respond to that because he had 10 teams in Germany on the ground and he was afraid for them. And in this report, they found that those Oxford Group people had been sent to the front lines. They'd been sent to concentration camps, and the Gestapo had them under surveillance. So he had a huge impact, globally. Our Secretary of War allowed his Oxford Group men out of the war at the close of it early because they believed that the Oxford Group was the only solution to a war-torn Europe, and he wanted to get his teams working, quickly. So it was much bigger at the time Henrietta was becoming involved with this than just a little kind of Bible study group.
Right. But how it really started was more of one individual reaching out to another and kind of having it had this global moment or this global connection. It really was one person just connecting to another in a way and speaking to them and making that connection. And that's what happened here in Akron was, and I'll start, you can jump in, but if I get anything wrong, but Bud Firestone, Russell Firestone went by the nickname Bud. He was Harvey Firestone's son, one of Harvey Firestone, the founder of Firestone Tire Rubber Company. He was an alcoholic, and he was actually found sobriety through an Oxford Group member and kind of following Oxford Group practices. And Harvey Firestone was so thrilled and just grateful that his son had found sobriety that he decided to invite Frank Bookman and a team of Oxford Group members, and I think it was about 40 or 50 people maybe, came to Akron in January of 1933 for a 10-day long kind of conference. And thousands of people went to these meetings. It was amazing to read the articles in the Akron Beacon Journal of the meetings were the Mayflower Ballroom was so overrun, they had to have satellite meetings at Polsky's, and just it really captured this entire city's attention for this 10-day time period, and Henrietta was one of those people, as well as the Seiberlings, Frey and Gertrude Seiberling, and some of their other children. Everyone kind of went to check it out, what's this all about, and everyone knew Russell Firestone socially, and kind of knew his struggles, so they wanted to see, like, what is it that really had such a profound change on this person?
Right, exactly, yeah. It was pretty remarkable stories when you look into what exactly happened there. And Russell Firestone's wife, Dorothy, was giving one of the testimonials there, and how her marriage had been saved by this because of her husband's alcoholism. And Henrietta was in the audience. So there was a huge impact there immediately, because Henrietta had a set of her own challenges. Then she was looking for something, because they didn't have the group therapies and things like that we have today, and everybody in Akron's peeking through the gates because this is Akron royalty, and that kind of thing. So it's kind of...
Yeah, and Henrietta even said in an oral history that Dorothy Firestone was from Texas. She was from Texas, so I think she felt a kind of a connection to her. The fact that they were both these ex-Southern women living in Ohio and kind of navigating those probably changes from what they were used to. And then, as you kind of alluded to, Henrietta was married to Fred Seiberling, the oldest Seiberling son, and they just had a fairly unhappy marriage, and had some challenges, and had, they never divorced, but they were pretty much separated. And she said in the same oral history that she actually initially went for Fred in the hope that Fred would go and maybe he would be changed and impacted by this as Russell Firestone was. She kind of looked at it from, he's the one that needs to be fixed. And what was interesting is she went to these different meetings, and in the oral history she says every day she thought, well, I don't need to go back. This is enough. I'm a religious person. I understand. I know where I'm coming from. And then she said every day she'd kind of wake up and feel compelled to go back again, and compelled to go back the next day. So she really, really connected with her. And then on the last day in a meeting, she did what's called give witness. So she stood up and testified and said in this oral history that, I always thought I was a good person. I always thought that I did the right thing. I always thought I was religious, but I have now found that this is the way, this is the path I'm supposed to be on. And so it kind of turned in her head to be, I have to look inside myself, and I have to examine myself, and only then will I find happiness and peace. And then that journey really started from that point moving forward for her.
I'm so grateful for the research that Julie's done here, because it matches up the studying that I've done over the years. And a lot of things I didn't know, and it's a lot of tedious work for you through the letters and stacks and stacks and stacks. But it's really brought Henrietta into three-dimensional person, and Amy too.
Right, another researcher we collaborated with, absolutely.
I had the joy of doing some research projects out of state with this lady, who's a great deal of fun, and so that was fun too.
And it's. We're very fortunate here at Stan Hywet, just in general, not only when being able to talk about Henrietta Seiberling, but Frey and Gertrude, and as well as their extended family. We just have a volume of materials, tons of archives and letters in our own repository, and then down at the Ohio History Connection in Columbus, and some materials at the University of Akron. Special collection. So the family really has come to life over the last kind of 5 years, and we've learned so much more about them. And Henrietta too, because I think when people first learn about the story, or kind of if you read books about when Dr. Bob and Bill W. were introduced to each other by Henrietta, she's this person who was just a nice lady who happened to kind of connect these two men, and then she fades to black in the background. She disappears. But really what we've learned, and what will be presented in the new exhibit, when hopefully people that are watching it to come to Stan Hywet and visit the Gate Lodge in person, is how involved she stayed and how committed she was to bringing people to sobriety, and how connected she was to both Dr. Bob and Bill W. in having these conversations about how can we do this, and what does this look like, and can we help anyone else. And she herself, she's described by both Bill W. and later writings he did, and she describes herself as, she said, they needed me as a non-alcoholic because I could give them a perspective, an outside perspective. I could give them information that they, because they are thinking within the terms of their own sobriety and what do they need. And so she said, my perspective was very important. And it was so interesting to learn also about how much they were in and out of this house. Because I think people think, oh, they had this one meeting and then that was it. Everything happened down the street, a mile down the road at Dr. Bob's house. But really, they would be here for meetings all the time. She had people that were working on their sobriety, staying here, visiting her on a daily basis. Through the 30s into the 40s, she's writing letters to her children, her son who's serving in World War II, and her daughters that are away at college at that point in the 40s, talking about these individuals she's trying to help, the different challenges they're having. So she was committed to this, even though she was never a member, or she herself didn't suffer from alcoholism, and there was also a misconception that Fred maybe was possibly an alcoholic, her husband, and there's really been no evidence that I've found or anyone's really been able to find that that's true. So we think that just came from some kind of place where people thought, well, if she was involved, there had to have been some kind of alcoholic association, but we haven't been able, that seems to be disproven. She came out of a place from her Oxford group roots of, you do the self-examination, you work on yourself, but then part of that journey is also to then reach out to others and try to help them as well. And for Henrietta, it was a very God-centered place, and I think there was, I don't know if you can speak kind of more to how important that religious aspect was to her.
To Henrietta.
Yeah.
The two pillars really for the Oxford group were one where they called them the four absolutes: the honesty, unselfishness, purity, and love. And that was an inventory system for what you're thinking or doing. And if you, Dr. Bob had said he used it as a yardstick because that was all they had back then. And if you could measure what you're thinking or doing by that, and you're not too far off the mark, he's probably on the right track, is what he had said. But that was the Oxford group's inventory system that they used. And these are the things that eventually the 12-step programs would be built off of. So if you took as honest as inventory as you could, it didn't have to be perfect, but the willingness had to be there. And then you engaged in what they call morning quiet time, when they would sit and they would write for about 10 or 15 minutes, just a free flow of writing, kind of in a meditation state of mind on whatever you might be struggling with, or a challenge or a question you may have. That if you were living by those four absolutes, you could count on the fact that in that writing somewhere would be some guidance. And you would take that to somebody else that's following a spiritual path. And here Henrietta would call Anne, Dr. Bob's wife, and they would chat back and forth, and some of the other ladies did too. You would compare notes. Anytime that system had some criticism, they always omitted the fact that there was a huge checking system that went with it. You had to check it against spiritual literature, possibly your Bible, maybe your minister. If it's really difficult, another person that's walking a spiritual path. So you weren't just off doing this on your own. Bill W. had left a quote that there's nothing worse than a power monger who thinks he got it straight from God and he's off running on his mission. So there was a lot of guardedness about that process. But we have several incidents when Henrietta actually affected the evolution of this program, and she stated it was her guidance that did it. She had called a gentleman nearby here who was connected to the Portage Country Club, because when Bill was in town, he was running out of money, and his job enterprise that he was here was finished, and she didn't want him to get away. So she had him put up 2 weeks at the Portage Country Club. And she said it was her guidance that told her to do that. Because she did, Dr. Bob and Bill were able to work together, and then Bill winds up moving into Dr. Bob's house for the rest of the summer. And that was where they started to hash out this recovery program and so forth. And there were several other incidents which she attributes to her guidance.
Right, she had guidance to get Dr. Bob to confess to being a drinker. That was guidance on her part, where she called a special meeting of the Oxford group and called the people that were going to attend and said, look, we need to have an impact on Dr. Bob. He has this issue, he's not admitting it, and he can't begin to kind of move forward from it until he admits to what his problem is. And so she said, we're all going to confess to something that's very close to us. None of this like, oh, I'm late all the time and that's not respectful of people. Like, you have to really share something that's valuable. And so everybody did, and she said kind of like she was holding her breath in the meeting, like, is Dr. Bob going to share? And that's when he did the kind of famous quote of, I'm a secret drinker and I can't stop. And so they said, do you want us to pray for you? And he said, yes. And so that kind of began his journey towards sobriety, and it wasn't instantaneous, but he did begin. And she also said she got through guidance. She kind of almost came to her in a dream, I think she describes, where she woke up and Dr. Bob, she felt the guidance that Dr. Bob must never drink again. He had to completely quit alcohol, and that was kind of, to her, a revolution. As she said, to her, men just drank casually, and you were a gentleman, and you maintained your liquor, and so but she felt like that was the way that he would kind of successfully stop drinking, was to
That was a very profound, actually, what she said to us today, because we have such a thing as recovery. It almost sounds like a no-brainer, where you're not supposed to drink anymore. But they didn't understand addiction back then. And usually abstinence, total abstinence, was not part of alcohol recovery. They would send them to these posh little farms and so forth, and to get healthy and get well, and shine them up and send him home, and just drink like a gentleman kind of thing. They just didn't understand that. So what she said to him was actually profound for the era that they were living in. And again, that was supposedly, she said that came through her guidance. And what they say is, eventually, as you work on this, and Henrietta was, academically, she was gifted. She was enrolled at Vassar when she was 16 years old. She was a concert pianist and an opera singer. And she had the self-discipline on board, I believe, to make herself sit and do something that you might not rather be doing at the moment, because it takes a lot of practice. It's easy to do it for 2 weeks, but to be doing it 3 years later, every day, without fail, it's not quite so easy.
Right.
So she was able to do that, and I think that the results, had come from that.
Right, and we're very lucky because we have her quiet time journal.
That's
Her
amazing.
quiet time journals.
Just we have 141 pages
Yeah.
of her handwritten morning meditation. All the Oxford groupers kept Oxford group notebooks, they call them, of their morning, what they got in the morning and so forth. And
Right.
it's just, it's incredible that that's here.
And it's interesting too, because she'll, talk, I need to work on being less stubborn, and I need to. So I mean, she really did. You can feel the seriousness of her dedication to that, to the self-examination and to practicing quiet time in the morning. And Gertrude Seiberling, also, we have a quiet time journal from her, so we know that she did it as well. So it was. And their relationship was a little strained, these two women who lived in such close proximity to each other, but because Henrietta and Fred had such a difficult relationship, Gertrude very often, of course, would kind of be a little bit, take the side of her son, but it seems like at a certain point in their lifetime, they reconciled. She was able to reconcile with her in-laws, and I think there was some acknowledgement on their end that their son was not perfect, and obviously contributed to the unhappiness of the relationship as well. So, you can see also kind of in her journal, back to that, the evolution of her growth kind of as a person. It's really interesting document.
One of the things I found remarkable when you first brought this to light was that because they have looked at the 1933 Mayflower Party as the entrance of the Oxford Group into Akron. Now, I knew it came in 1931 through Jimmy Newton, but the letter from James, from when he was at Princeton, 14 years prior, the second son here, I believe.
Penfield, yes, Penfield, yeah.
His letter, he had run into Frank Bookman at Princeton, because, like I said, Bookman was doing campus ministry and into the Ivy League schools by then. And it was eight pages, single-space typewritten. It absolutely set him on fire.
Right.
And that lasted for the rest of his life. And it was amazing. So the big Mayflower do that they had there wasn't really the Seiberling's first introduction into this whole Oxford Group story.
It is interesting how they kind of, these historical moments kind of wound their way to collide in January of 1933, but they kind of skipped past each other. these different moments. So history is so interesting in that way.
This intervention that we were talking about basically is what it was when they were trying to draw Dr. Bob out. After he admitted he was a drinker, it was just shortly over 2 weeks later that a man stepped off the train in downtown Akron, and that was Bill W. So it was like that was kind of one of those moments where, and Henrietta had been praying for Dr. Bob and during her morning quiet time on this situation during that time. So when the phone rang here in the gatehouse, Bill W. is calling for help from the Mayflower Hotel. Henrietta's not in here scratching her head wondering what to do. She's been working on this for several weeks, and she just said, get right out here.
Yeah, she fully believed that God would provide the answer for Dr. Bob, and that answer was Bill W. Like, she just, as soon as he said, I'm a rum hound from New York, and she said, you have to come out here immediately. Like, she knew that that was the answer. I mean, I think a lot of, there are, to some of us, that to have that kind of instantaneous recognition of that is so astonishing, to have that, like, this is the answer, and know it with emphatically.
Well, that comes up in all of the Oxford Group literature that you can read. They didn't put out a lot of literature because Frank Buckland was very cautious about not starting another religion or a sect or a denomination.
Right.
So their official literature is very light, but many of the Oxford groupers were affluent, and they were academically astute. They had, they were well educated, and many of them wrote about their own accounts.
Mm-hmm.
See, so those books are out there,
Right.
and when you read through that and look at the account after account of exactly what we're talking about, and then you see what happened here, it just illuminates all of it. And one of the points you brought out about her, expecting this, Anne's, Dr. Bob's wife's journal, again, they kept an Oxford Group notebook. In there, she writes in capital letters, expect guidance. So you sit down into this process expecting to get the answers that you need. It's not, well, I wonder if let's see what happens kind of thing. It really was a faith move.
Right, and what I was going to add to that was that, it just left my head. Is there anything we haven't talked about, Charles, that you can think of?
I think that's pretty much it. I was just trying to go over because when I run into people that when we're delivering the interpretation to people, you understand the holes and what they don't know and where they connect at. And I think one of them was the size and those four the things that the Oxford groupers were doing here, what Henrietta was doing. But what your work, you must have just dug through with a shovel. Because these wonderful things are coming out that just fill in all of these stories and rounded Henrietta out. And my question for you is then, what I've always wanted to ask you, we don't get a lot of time to sit down and talk. You came here with the, to Stan Hywet with the credentials and the work experience and so forth, and this is wonderful mansion and collection, and the Seiberling family stories with their philanthropy and their community involvement is wonderful. And then, by the way, down in the gatehouse, something happened that changed the world and saved 1 million people's lives.
Right.
What do you think about that? And I always wondered, how did you come to know that, or what did you think when you found it out, or what?
I don't remember the exact moment. I'm sure it was my coworker Tom who walked me around the house for the first time and probably gave me kind of the tour and the story, and I'm sure I was like, really? That's so wild, what an idiosyncratic thing to have down here, on this same, because you think that this is the story. Like, the story's up there.
Right.
And it's so interesting that, not to disparage, it's there, to some people this is more important, and it is more important, and this story, for as much as the Seiberlings have done for Akron, this is global. What happened in this little 4-room house has this tremendous global impact, has literally saved people's lives. It really is almost indescribable to think that these 3 people were in this house on this one evening, and Anne was here too, so there were 4 people here on that evening, and what came of it? A simple conversation. I think that's such the essence of history, is that a simple conversation can change the world, like for good, bad, you know, there are moments you can argue in both directions, but that's what this really was. And that all these three people, I mean, we didn't really touch on this too much, but Dr. Bob and Bill W. were both in the Oxford group as well. Bill W. was as well. And so they kind of had the same foundation, but then this was, you know, the title of the exhibit in here was The Spark for the Movement. And this was what happened here was really amazing. So, and she has been a phenomenal person to research and so interesting. And for, you know, as a historian, as someone who loves to do research for a living as part of my job, even if I know 99%, I want to know that 1%. Right. I want to know what's missing. And so sometimes the more answers you have, it just creates more questions. How did she feel about this? Or what was her reaction to that? But luckily, the nice thing about researching in the 20th century, we have audio recordings and right. You know, no video in this instant, but at least someone was able to do oral history with her before she passed away on a couple different instances, and we've been able to talk to her children, and you know, they could talk about what it was like here and talked about the people kind of coming in and out and all the work that their mother did while they were here as teenagers and college-age people in the 30s and 40s. And you know, she's just a tremendous woman. She's someone who, yeah, because women were in a way very marginalized back then. Or, you know, you kind of had to work within that little framework that you were given, and she did so much. As you said, she was highly educated, she was intelligent, she was a trained musician, which just, you know, she had that creative part of her brain, and it all just coalesced into, you know, this movement. But to her, it was one person at a time. Let me help Dr. Bob. Let me help the next person. Let me help the next person. It really was to her one person at a time. I don't think she thought of how many people, we have to help 30 people today. It's like, I'm going to help this one person today. But then I think as the movement grew, they recognized the spider web effect of it, as if we help one person and that person can help these two people, and it grows and grows and grows, and that's, you see that in the numbers.
You're kind of touching on there on the question is, if it did all these fantastic things, what happened to the Oxford group? I mean, why is that not here today? And that actually touches on what Julie was saying there, because they did begin on the individual basis, the one-on-one or the just very small groups, and they're working through this way. And as the decades piled up, the founder, Frank Bookman, is getting older and older, and he has a major stroke. And the man that they had groomed to take over for him dies 3 years after Frank Bookman did. And they really had trouble sustaining all of that loss for that upper leadership and so forth. And what had happened was they're moving from this one-on-one type movement into these enormous conventions and so forth. The Hollywood Bowl in 1939 had 30,000 people. It was an Oxford group meeting of 30,000, 15,000 outside, they can't get in. The president sends a message, they've got celebrity speakers and so forth, and it took a long time for that to happen, but that's basically what happened. And that was told to me by a man in London who worked with Frank Buckman, an elderly man at the Oxford Group office there. I was fortunate enough to work with him on 3 different occasions, and that was what how he described it, is they just lost their track. They got off track, they started to become enamored with world affairs a little bit too much, and of their own notoriety kind of thing. So there's a lesson in that. There's a lesson in that. They still exist. It became MRA, Moral Rearmament, in 1939, and then in 2001 it became Initiatives of Change. And they have an office in Richmond and one in London, which is still there. And they do very good work. It's just a lot smaller scale than what we were.
Right, but, and I mean, it's, as someone who, and I think the point that I lost my thought for was about how the Oxford Group was a movement that worked within your existing religion. So whether you were Catholic,
exactly.
You were Jewish, whatever sect of Christianity you were, you didn't have to leave, you didn't have to stop being Methodist, you didn't have to stop being Lutheran. Oxford Group was just kind of another layer of spiritualism on top of that. And some religions, of course, did not appreciate that or did not agree with that. Like Catholics, of course, had a big problem with that. But that was the idea, was that it wasn't superseding your religion, it was supposed to kind of work with your religion. And it's interesting because I've read some of the books and doing the research. One, which you talk about a lot, is called Soul Surgery. Mm-hmm. And then what's the one that's written by the layman? what is it just called? What is the Oxford Group?
Yes.
Yes, that's another one you can find. You can find these in used bookstores, online, and it's almost, it's something that we can all still do today, you know, to kind of do that soul surgery, that self-examination. I mean, it's a very, it's a great practice. It's just something that's very kind of rewarding to do. So it's interesting. Their values still, I think, are current today. It's not, people might even equate quiet time to meditation. You know, you can make these kind of more 21st century parallels with it.
One of the treats I got, I started this when it was about 2000, it was after Irene died, who was occupying the house. She was 108.
Yes.
They had a little get together here with what they were going to do with the gatehouse, and I decided to come down. And John Seiberling was here, and he gave a talk, and he always came back.
Who's Henrietta's oldest?
Henrietta's oldest son. He became our congressman for 16 years, I believe. And he would always come back and help out with, you know, any time he could. He was very generous with his time. And he gave a little talk here, and Irene's niece, the eldest daughter that had lived in here to a very old age, her niece was here, and she had taken care of her for, you know, a while in the end there. And she said, I'm so glad they're going to do something. She said, every Founders Day, we've got 50 people peeking in the windows here trying to find out what's going on. You know, and they knew the story, but they couldn't get in. But I got a chance to talk to John Seiberling afterward, and that was actually what started me on some of this. Really was, he told myself and someone else the story. When he was in Congress, Tip O'Neill, this is back in the 70s, Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House. And he knew about John's mother and her handling in AA and hand in the starting of it. So the Soviet Union had sent a delegation to the United States to find out what we do about alcoholism. Mm-hmm. And Tip O'Neill put John in charge of that, and it was John Seiberling that took Alcoholics Anonymous to the Soviet Union. In a country where the state is sovereign and this is a spiritual program. So that was kind of
right. Just and he was, just to finish up with Congressman Seiberling. He went with his mother to the Mayflower Hotel in 1933, January, at the age of 13 or 14 years old. I think he was a young teenager, but she took him, and the Oxford Group really stayed with him his whole life, and they would write about it when he was serving in the war, and he was at Harvard going to college, and they really spoke, you know, mother to son. But it was a peer-to-peer conversation about, you know, kind of always maintaining that self-examination and also reaching out to others, reaching out to people and, you know, helping them with their own guidance, helping them with their own spiritual journey. So it was something that became really multi-generational. You know, it didn't stop with Henrietta, it really continued with her children as well.
She left a legacy, not just for the community and so forth, mm-hmm. but for her own children. So, yeah.
Well, we will stop here, but thank you so much, Charles, for joining.
You're welcome.
We have so much fun talking together, but
it's gonna be an hour long.
We will leave you for now, and I'm going to invite everyone to please come and visit Stan Hywet Hall Gardens. Come visit our gate lodge and see the new exhibit for yourself. It will be kind of completed mid-July. We've pushed our date back a little bit because of COVID, but if you come anytime, you know, after August 1st, the exhibit will be done and ready, and you can come and learn all about Henrietta and that first conversation with Dr. Bob and Bill W. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed being here.